Now, this is the second installment of the series, A History of Israel. Today, the topic is the idea and the return. Before we start, I wanted to remind you that in the 19th century in Europe, there were two important developments. One was the development which was happening in all countries and all nationalities, where there was the beginning of a assertion of nationalism, with individual group started to feel the desire to become independent rather than being part of an empire. We see this in Italy, in Bulgaria, in all of the countries, a desire to create an identity of its own nation. The second element that we developed, that we have to understand, is that Jews in Western Europe started to feel a great sense of independence, emancipation. They were declared citizens, they were able to go to universities, they would go business without very few restrictions. Whereas in Russia, for example, where almost 5 million Jews lived, the situation was completely different. There were many restrictions. It was difficult to trade, difficult to create a business. The number of people in universities was very small. So the Russian Jews, which included the Pale settlement, including Lithuania and Poland, that was a time where Jews started to feel, well, how come the Western Jews in Western Europe, they're beginning to feel free and we are not? So it started to develop in Russia, especially, and also in Germany in some way, a desire, an understanding that the Jews was a problem. Remember that Karl Marx wrote the famous The Jewish Question, the Judenfrage. And one of the first exponents of the question of how to resolve the problem of the Jews in Europe, and remember that as nationalism started, the Jew remained even more alien than before. When there were many nationalities in one empire, it wasn't so bad. But now that the Jews, the French or the Germans were who they were, the Jews felt more of an alien. And so even in Western Europe, you started to feel that problem of what to do, how to feel the Jews. And that's one of the reasons why one of the first books that we're going to analyze today is by Moses Hess. I'm going to do a question first, and that I want you to see from time to time. I'm going to show you a word so that you can see the names that I will be discussing. So one of them is Moses Hess. So Moses Hess, a German with socialist tendencies. He actually went to University of Bonn, and his colleague was none other than Karl Marx. Karl Marx actually ridicules Moses Hess in his On the Jewish Question. The point of Moses Hess is essentially that no matter what the Jews are going to do in Germany, they're never going to assimilate. And therefore, he writes his important book called Rome and Jerusalem in 1862, where he essentially begins to anticipate doctrines of Zionism, saying that only in Palestine, only in the ancestral land, Jews will be able to feel that they are part of that land without feeling like strangers. And he also believes that the Jews only in Israel will be able to exercise the socialist principles which he espoused. So he suggested a possibility that with the help of Jewish princes like Montefiore and Rothschild, they would be able to colonize Palestine. So this was Rome and Jerusalem, the first book that we're going to be discussing today, Moses Hess. There was another person in Odessa, Leon Pinsker, who also wrote a very important book called Auto Emancipation. This is Leo Pinsker. He wrote the book Auto Emancipation. I want to discuss with you that he was one of the very educated Jews, and this was a development that had begun, and I want to point out this word, Haskalah. Haskalah represents it means enlightenment. It was a kind of a movement among secular Jews who were not Orthodox, to try to participate into the Jewish culture, into the general culture, Jews, but as a culture, not as Orthodox or religious people. This movement, which also started in the 19th century, has an important implication for the return to Palestine, as I will explain. So these Jews begin to go to universities and they study sciences, and they want to participate and want to create a kind of a Jew who is a full cultural participant in the culture of the nations. And among these people, one of the things that they do is they begin to revive the Hebrew language. They don't want to be assimilated. They want to assert Jewish culture among the other cultures. So while they are not religious, they want to emphasize the Jewish history, the Jewish contributions. So they revive the Hebrew language, and they write novels. These are very literary people. I want to mention some names in this book of Haskalah, people who want to go to university. One of them is Yehuda Leib Gordon. Yehuda Leib Gordon is a famous person who made that statement, be a Jew at home and a man in the street, outside. So that's the way you solve the problem of Jews. You can't separate yourself from the community, but you can, whenever you want a Jew and a private life, you can be outside. This is an important person. Another person that we want to talk about is Abraham, very famous Jewish literary person, Avraham Mapu, and he also writes in Hebrew. So here we see the utilization of Hebrew not for Talmudic or religious purposes, but for just literature. So these people, Mapu and Gordon and many others, are creating this movement of Haskalah. Now we're going to talk about one man who was a fruit of this Haskalah movement, Leon Pinsker, the person that I mentioned before. Leon Pinsker was the son of one of these enlightened families in Odessa. He was studying medicine, but eventually he realized the Jews would not be allowed to enter the mainstream. And so, similarly to Hess, he wrote a book called Auto Emancipation, saying that the concept of emancipation of the Western countries was an illusion. He lived in Odessa, and Jews will always be strangers. And the only way that the Jews can be really feel like citizens would be when they have their own territory. He became one of the most admired men in Russian Jewry. It's interesting that one of the things he did, at the beginning, he did not think that the territory had to be necessarily in Eretz Israel. But eventually, the other people that he collected to understand that Jews needed to have an independent territory, they were they started to talk about Zion alone. And here we come to a very important point, and a development that in this time, just as we have Haskalah, enlightened Jews writing novels, reviving the Hebrew, um, we have also these groups that begin to dream of Jewish culture and Jewish nationality. Groups like Ezra, Maccabi, and eventually these groups begin to be called themselves Chovevei Zion, Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. And they form clubs to talk, to discuss, philosophy, ideas of what Jews should do with regard to returning to the land of Israel. And I want to point out that Haskalah, one of the things that Haskalah did in reviving the Hebrew language as a secular language, it also gave the people the impetus of the dream that they would actually could be part, they could return to the land where the language was born. And so the Haskalah, even though it was secular, had a very important connection to the rise of the concept of the return. So in addition to the religious circles where we pray for the return to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and so on, in addition to this, you have these other movements, secular, socialist even, but who understand that the Jewish people need to return. And that's the idea of the return. And in 1890, Leon Pinsker convenes a group, a congress of all of these people, Chovevei Zion groups, and they have a meeting in a city, and they actually begin to talk about the return to Zion. This is very important to understand that the idea of Zionism was started already in this time. I want to point out an interesting idea that many of these groups that wanted to return to Zion, and these groups of people who wanted to go to Zion, among them there were many Russian students, and we will see why Russian Jews were so important in this matter. That the Russian Jews started to be a very important part of these Chovevei Zion groups. One of them in Berlin was Chaim Weizmann. So these groups begin to rise and grow in all the cities, in Vienna, Romania, Berlin, of course in Russia, in Odessa, and many other places in Russia. Even there were groups even in the United States called Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. And they were just groups, intellectual groups, idea groups. So I want to point out that although the political program of Zionism is going to begin with the intellectuals, the non-religious intellectuals, and the vital force for the return to Zion came from the Orthodox Jews, because it is the people who are Torah people who understand that the only place is Eretz Israel. And although some of them may have entertained the idea of returning to other places just to have a territory, the idea of Zion and Tfilot and the prayers would make them only the territory could be the land of Israel. Now, some Orthodox rabbis, particularly, were very interested in the return to Zion, and we will talk in a moment. The word Zionism, by the way, is coined by Dr. Nathan Birnbaum in the city of Vienna. Nathan Birnbaum, I write all these names for you so you can see them. Nathan Birnbaum in Vienna is the one who actually coined the name Zionism. Now, as I said, although Zionism begins with these intellectuals, there are a lot of rabbis who will begin to talk about this. I'll start with Yehuda Alkalai, a rabbi from Yugoslavia, anyway, in the city of Semlin near Belgrade. he begins to write, and in his book he writes in Ladino, Darchei Noam, and he is actually begins to talk to people about the necessity to return to the land of Israel. And he writes several books. Coincidentally, one of his students was this man, Simon Loeb Herzl. So this was the grandfather of Theodor Herzl. He was a student of Yehuda Alkelad, this rabbi who was talking about return to Zion. Another important rabbi in these things was the Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Kalischer in the 19th century actually thinks of the return to Zion. He writes a book called Drishat Zion, in which he actually even suggests that we could even renew the ritual of sacrifices in the Temple Mountain. Another important rabbi is Shmuel Mohilover, who is actually going to create a group that we now know as Mizrahi, saying that the Jewish people can create a spiritual center. Mizrahi is a conflation of the words Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center of the Jewish people. So, Rav Kook says that the combination of secular people interested in Zion and these rabbis shows that although the secular people the Maskilim were only secular in their outward form, but inside they were imbued with the divine spirit. They, even against their will, they wanted to go back to Israel. So I want to explain one of the important parts that is moving this idea begins to have its urgency in Russia. In 1881, the Tsar is assassinated by revolutionaries, and the son who follows him is Alexander III. Alexander III, in 1881, initiates a series of pogroms and restricting Jews, called the May Laws, which made the life of the Jewish people impossible in Russia. And one of his main advisors, a Russian by the name of Konstantin Pobedonostotsev, Alexander, the main advisor to Alexander III, is actually creates anti-Semitism as an official policy. And the reason this Mamzer wanted to create anti-Semitism was he wanted to get the Jews out of Russia. He said 1/3 should emigrate, 1/3 we will kill, and the other third will assimilate. So Russia's Jews have three options. One of them is to emigrate. The other one is to work for a revolution, as Tolstoy does, and many others. Many Jews become socialists because of this. And the third option is Zionism. And many of them are the groups of Chovevei Zion. So now that we have the picture of, by the way, it's interesting that somebody once said Alexander III was probably, after Hitler, the greatest persecutor of Jews. And yet, in Europe, whenever he traveled, he was feted and celebrated and given attention. In fact, one of the most beautiful bridges in Paris is Pont Alexander III. Pont Alexander. So this Um, this pressure created by the Russian persecution creates this desire for the people to emigrate and create Zionism, and the desire to move to Israel. We'll talk a little bit quickly. Um, at the beginning of the 19th century, there are no more than 5,000 to 6,000 Jews in the whole of Palestine. By mid-century, more Jews came, about 17,000 Jews. And most of them were religious, and mainly Sephardic. The Muslims, tolerated the Sephardic, but they didn't like the Ashkenazim at all. They were like strangers to them. So it was difficult with Ashkenazim also to settle in Israel. One of the reasons that the customs of the Ashkenazim in Israel are following Sephardic customs is precisely because the majority, when they came to Israel, they adopted the customs of the place, which was Sephardic. Life in Palestine was very difficult. The Turkish authorities were incompetent. Security was terrible. Bedouin raiders would come always and destroy and kill and rape and steal. So it was very difficult to live in Israel. And however, in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire needs Western Europe support against Russian invasion. And therefore, they begin to provide some protection to the European citizens in the Ottoman Empire. And that's what is called the capitulatory arrangement of 1840. And this guaranteed that the European nationals would have a legal and financial immunity under the protection of their own respective consuls. This protection eventually was also extended to Jews, and that also began to increase immigration of Jews into Israel. The Jews were dependent. They did not have jobs or business. All Jews mostly were dependent on what is called the Chalukah, money collected outside of Eretz Israel and the diaspora that was sent to Israel to support the settlements of Jews. The country was very backward, as we discussed in the previous lecture. By 1869, the first road was cut through the mountains to connect Jerusalem and Jaffa, Derech Yafo. This is the first time, this little road that today is a major highway, 4-lane highway. In 1870, the French group Alliance Israélite Universelle creates in Israel an agricultural school called Mikveh Israel. And I want to just show you where in the map where this is. In Israel, you see here next to Jaffa, this is Mikveh Israel, the first agricultural school, which was the first attempt to make, on the part of the French Jews and English Jews, the desire to create in Israel some Jews who were going to be productive, working, not just studying. A lot of these settlements started with Sir Moses Montefiore, who used the largest portion of his wealth to fund the welfare of Jews in every land, but especially in Eretz Israel. He interceded with Tsars, with Turkish sultans, with the King of Prussia, with the Shah of Persia, with the Viceroy of Egypt, and a Sultan of Morocco, and many other statesmen in order to help Jews. He was a religious man, made many voyages to the land of Israel. He made his money, as you recall, because he had a connection he established through pigeons to find out who would win the battle at Waterloo. When he discovered that Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo, the market took a different turn. And since he was the first one to know about it, he became a multi-millionaire. He is the first one who creates a little community outside of the walls of Jerusalem, what is called today the Yemin Moshe. If you go to Israel, Sidi Moshe could be put there a windmill to provide the Jews with a mill to create to have flour and be able to make some money. In 1855, he also buys a little land in what is called Moza settlement. Now, in 1869, a group of Jews also from the old city come out from the walls, and they build a little area outside of Jerusalem called Nachalat Shiv'ah. He, Joel Moshe Solomon, and 6 friends. If you go to Jerusalem today, you will see that in that area, the main road is called Joel Moshe Solomon. Today is a pedestrian mall. That area, Nachalat Shiv'ah, is called Shiv'ah because there were 7 people who built those homes. Another group in 1875 goes out of this old city, which was in terrible condition, hygienic and safety, and build also a little new neighborhood called Mea Shearim. It's only by 1914 that the new city outnumbered Jews in the old city. In 1875, again, Moshe Solomon looks for cultivable land, and he buys outside of Jaffa a little wild stretch, and I want to point it out to you now where it is. This is outside of Jaffa, a Petach Tikva. We don't see it here on the map, but it is just here in this spot. Petach Tikva, and they begin to cultivate the land, but unfortunately, mosquitoes bring malaria, and some of them leave. They cannot sell the harvest because, the Jews, the Orthodox Jews, call these people heretics because instead of learning and studying, they are cultivating land, something that was ridiculous for them. Many of these settlers returned to Jerusalem, and Petach Tikva lapses into wilderness. However, salvation is on the road, on the way. What is that salvation? In Russia, with the pressure of the pogrom, the persecution, the restrictions imposed by Alexander III, Jews begin to feel the urgency. And these Chovevei Tzion groups begin to think practically of moving to a land of Israel, not just talking about it. One of the people who was very involved in this, and I want to point out again to you, is this man we mentioned about before. Somebody mentioned that it had not been clear his name. Lawrence Oliphant. Lawrence Oliphant, a British diplomat who was very convinced, for religious reasons, Christian reasons, that the Jews had to return to the land of Israel. And he tries to bring them money, to arrange things with the Turkish authorities. And he meets with the people in Odessa, Jews in Odessa, to help them move into Israel. But his efforts are not yet successful, and the people there begin to be impatient. So 1882, a group of young men and women created a separate group called Bilu. In Hebrew means Bet Israel Lechu V'Nelcha. House of Israel, let us go to Zion. And 13 young men and women on July 1882 sailed to the land of Israel, not waiting for Lawrence Oliphant. They buy land and they settle in the place, beautiful place, called Rishon LeZion. Here it is. Rishon LeZion, south of Jaffa. So you have Mikveh Israel, Petach Tikva, and Rishon LeZion. This is what is called the first Aliyah. First Aliyah is Jews who are moving to Eretz Israel between 1882 and 1893. This period of 10 years, about 25,000 Jews enter Palestine. And they begin to buy land. First of all, they revitalize Petah Tikva. Some build another colony just north of Petah Tikva, right over here, called Zamarin, which eventually will be renamed Zichron Yaakov, when Rothschild is going to want to rename it after his father. Some of the Polish people, not Russians, begin to create the north. They go into the north, and they create this place called Yesud Ma'ala and Rosh Pina. Rosh Pina is here, north of the Galilee, or the lake of Tiberias, and Yesud Ma'ala. If you go to Israel, there's a great exhibit in that town, Yesud Ma'ala. So I recommend it. This is also Hovevei Zion, 1885. These are people who are building the land of Israel. The problem is they don't know they're not farmers. And although some agronomers from Europe are going to come and help them, they're not well equipped. They don't have the resources. In this area, remember Lake Hula here, used to be a lake, but it is essentially marshes attracting mosquitoes, malaria, and many, many of these settlers die. Their relatives in Europe are telling them, come back, you're going crazy. And there's no way that you can do it. And some of them, unfortunately, do return to Europe. It's a terrible, sad story. One of the Jerusalemites, one of the men in Jerusalem, a friend of yours, Moshe Solomon, these people, I want to tell you, I believe they are heroes. These people did something that was incredible. And I want to point out here this man, because this man is really one of the heroes of Israel. Man Jerusalem was part of this group of heretics that Yosef Solomon, I think I did not put his name here, Yoel Moshe Solomon. For those of you who may have known Rabbi Chavatzelit's wife, she was actually a relative of Yoel Moshe Solomon. So Yoel Moshe Solomon and Joseph Feinberg were two rebels, and they go out, take the Orthodox Jews out of Jerusalem. They build these rural agricultural colonies, and some of the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem think that these people are crazy. They are totally they were doing, leaving the yeshiva and leaving the study, and so Joseph, and now they're really suffering. The colonies are dying, and Joseph Feinberg realizes that they need help, and following an idea that Moses had of involving the Jewish millionaires in the colonization of Palestine, Joseph Feinberg decides to travel to Paris. And there he meets the Baron Edmond de Rothschild. Baron Edmond de Rothschild listens to Joseph Feinberg's story about these colonies and how they're dying, and the mosquitoes and the malaria. And at the end of the meeting, he actually goes out in tears. He breaks out in tears, and he begins to help the Jewish community. At the beginning, his contributions were very anonymous, and he wanted to remain anonymous. And so people just called him by the name of Hanadvan Hayadua, or the known the known And since 1882, when he meets Joseph Feinberg, he becomes very involved, building housing, synagogues, waterworks, wineries. Of course, he takes the city of Zamarin and wants to name it after his father, Zichron Yaakov. That's where the first winery in Israel, the Carmel, is actually created, 1888. And then eventually other cities. By 1888, there's a city of Hadera, Metula in the north. All of them established with the understanding that the Nadvan or the Nadiv will be able to help them. I want to point out, interestingly enough, that at the beginning, when as it happens often sometimes, as happens with people who give a lot of money, they have their own ideas about how the money should be spent. So they don't like how the farmers were working, and they begin to send their own experts and telling them what to plant. And so with the money and the help also comes a little bit of control. And this paternalism eventually erodes the farmers' initiative, and they begin to be resentful. And they, eventually, the dream of creating a cooperative where everybody would be able to help together, even though they were not socialists, but they wanted the concept of working together, begin to fall and begin to become capitalists. They take money and they find cheap labor, Arab labor. That's one of the problems that bring us to be here. Non-Jews are beginning to come in great numbers because there's work now. One of the points that the book from Tamim Memorial by John Peters makes, the population of the Arabs increases dramatically. And in fact, not only of Arabs from Syria and Lebanon, but also Muslims from Europe, Bosnia, and so on, and from other places. So they begin to become the dream of the Bilu, the dream, the idealistic dream, begins to falter a little bit. Rothschild visits Palestine in his yacht in 1898, and eventually he is going to be cutting his support, which is actually good for the Jewish people, because to the settlers, because they begin to create their own ideas. And but it is difficult. And by now there are 50,000 Jews in the land in Palestine, and they're working, but there are problems. Not only nowadays, not only the malaria, the disease, the lack of support, the lack of knowledge, the fact that a settlement begins with 100 families and then 80 families leave and only a few are left. This terrible problem that occurs here begins to feel that people begin to. Going to the land of Israel now begins to be in question. Can they do it? These beautiful communities are not working. The people are leaving. There's a lot of despair. In fact, Ahad Ha'am, one of the philosophers we call Ahad Ha'am, it was really Asher Ginsburg, says that he writes a famous articles, says Lo zu haderech, this is not the way to do it. Settlements without the proper preparation. He suggested that we should really organize ourselves better, talk first of all about reviving Jewish culture, not moving the people into the land of Israel, which is exactly what eventually the Herzl is going to insist. And so there's going to be a great dichotomy between Ahad Ha'am, who is a very important philosopher and a beautiful Hebrew writer, who emphasized that we needed to first elevate the culture of the Jews, the nationality of the Jews, and only afterwards go to Aliyah, when we are all prepared. Whereas Shadr created an urgency that they needed to attend to immediately, and they could not wait. But unfortunately, at that time, Ahad Am begins to have the upper hand. By the 1890s, at the end of this period, the ships in Jaffa were loading more passengers for Europe. They were disembarking. The Rothschild subsidies are beginning to dry up. And the first Aliyah that we just discussed, that started with such idealism and such dreams, ends with disappointment. However, they established the first bridgehead in Palestine. The establishment of a state was now becoming real, a place where Jews would no longer be the strangers, but the place, the people who actually create. And so now the salvation is not going to come from this first Aliyah or even from Rothschild, although he had created some infrastructure, but the salvation will come from the dream of this Viennese lawyer and journalist who has this crazy idea called Zionism, Theodor Herzl. And him, and about him, we will be discussing, God willing, in the next class. We will be discussing the life, the vision, and the contributions of Theodor Herzl.